Welcome, everybody, to the NYU Law Forum. Did I get that right? I'm supposed to give a promotional statement, but yeah, I got it right. Okay, excellent. So we can stop now because we're off to a good. We haven't screwed up yet. So I'm Sam Zakharoff. I'm a professor here, and this is a panel that we entitled "When the Border Comes to Town," and it reflects two things which are going to be the subject of our discussion. The first is the use of federal officers in more conventional law enforcement mechanisms through law enforcement taken from ICE and from the Border Patrol. And secondly, it refers to the fact that this is going on in ordinary towns and cities in the United States, and that there is a distinct law of the border that we'll talk about later that governs border stops that feels ill-suited, or at least not obviously suited, to the domestic setting. So our panel is really experts, and I'm just here to moderate. But the first, and I'll go in the order of the people sitting next to me, we'll speak in slightly different order. Vanita Gupta is a graduate of this law school. She's the head and the founder of the Center for Law and Public Trust. She's a distinguished scholar here. And it's just an amazing career. I think she's only graduated 20, 25 years ago or something like that. She's had every position imaginable in public interest enforcement, and then served in critical positions in the Justice Department, including as Associate Attorney General, which is the third highest position in the Justice Department. It's an amazing career, and it's great that she's with us here today, and also that she's been in residence with us at the law school. Next to Vanita is Brendan Del Pozo. Brendan is somebody who you don't see a CV like this every day. He was a cop in New York in this area. He rose to be a precinct captain. He rose from there to be chief of police in Burlington, Vermont. Along the way, he has more degrees than the rest of the table put together. And he is now, get this, professor at the Brown University School of Medicine. Clear, obvious career trajectory, and we'll get into that again. And then at the other end is Barry Friedman, like me, a professor here. I should just say that's enough because it's kind of boring. But Barry also has expertise in this area. One is that he runs the policing project here at NYU. And for many years, while that project was getting off the ground, Barry was also the reporter for the American Law Institute on principles of policing. And that's an extraordinary work done in conditions of post-George Floyd, things of that sort, so that the level of controversy and attention to what was produced there was really amazing. So, Brendan, let me start with you. Tell us what these ICE and Border Patrol incursions or entries into towns look like from the perspective of law enforcement. Do they look like you? Are they trained like you? Do they have the same outlook on citizen engagement you do? Sure. Tell us from the inside what it feels like.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for having me. And if I take too long, because I'm not sure of the timing, just give me some sort of subtle signal, though I don't intend to go that long. Just by way of bona fides, why, a man in a sweater is going to tell you about policing. I was in the NYPD for 19 years, started on patrol in East Flatbush and Crown Heights, commanded police precincts in the Bronx, as well as right here, this precinct, for 2 years. Very different than the Bronx. Courtney Love and Brooke Shield lived across the street from the command. Very different experiences with those folks. And then chief of police of Burlington, Vermont, responsible for the whole shebang in a small city. But that said, there's these... It's not exactly like a Slack channel, but there are police executives and former executives that get together over things like text or over a drink to just look at what the heck is happening with ICE. And I think that you could see a certain constellation of things coming together that gives like very poor and probably unconstitutional outcomes. And there's sort of like a trifecta of problems that we've seen happen with one bit of icing on the cake or one match thrown into all of that, whatever metaphor you want to use, that I think is insightful. So one of the things I did in the NYPD was a lot of policy and planning, plus leading an agency. And I say that to say this. One of the big problems with policing that yields poor outcomes is the very rapid growth in headcount. So if you want to, get a mandate or federal funding to add 10, 15, 20% to the size of your force, you end up doing things like relaxing hiring standards, relaxing the rate at which or the thoroughness of vetting the applicants. So we've seen that in ICE, where I think their goal is to hire thousands and thousands of people and to hire them quickly, right? So what we've seen through some journalists that went through the process and what we've seen on the street is lowering of standards and lack of thorough vetting. The second problem with this is poor training, right? So on its face, the training that ICE receives, for example, is if you look at the state-by-state standards by which police are certified throughout the United States, they are or among the lowest number of training hours ICE necessary to, if they were municipal police, they'd be at the lowest level of required hours for training. When they stand next to a Minneapolis police officer, they are standing next to a person who has received double the hours of basic training that they've received as ICE agents. Yet they're expected to run around in the street and perform very police-like patrol functions, right? So there's the poor training. And then there's inadequate, and another dimension to the poor training is its federal immigration enforcement training that is short, but also not tailored to the type of street-level enforcement they end up doing, right? And then the third part of this is inadequate field supervision, right? So if you're doubling the amount or tripling the amount of officers and you're flooding a city where there are more ICE agents than police officers, and they're poorly selected, improperly vetted, lower standards, the last saving grace would be, if you had some good ironclad field supervision, if you had street level and the policing case sergeants to really keep them under wraps. It is completely unclear. All of the anecdotal and visual evidence is they just do not have an adequate span of control nor adequately trained supervisors, right? Then you add to this finally that matched on all of this is an arrest quota, right? Of what amounts to being 3,000 arrests a day. And if you look at the reporting out of the Atlantic, it's like a mercilessly imposed quota. So you have poorly selected and inadequately vetted individuals who are poorly trained, inadequately supervised, and then told to go make an arrest quota at any cost. And then you get outcomes like this. I could say one or two more things?
Sure, go ahead. I have one question, but go ahead.
Yeah, if you want to ask the question.
Well, okay, so the question is, there's another dimension to it, and these are law students primarily in the audience, so let's cater to their parochialism. So some of us make a living at it, but anyway. One of the differences between the law governing border stops and the law governing policing in our cities is the level of constitutional vigilance that there is, so that at the border you can be stopped, you can be searched, you can have your cell phone, demands for your cell phone to be unlocked, you can have all these sorts of things that would be outrageous and intolerable in any city in the United States. And then on top of that, you have a pattern that they can enter buildings looking for people who have crossed illegally, but they can do so on the basis of administrative warrants, whereas we have citizen protections under the Constitution that requires going to court for. So concretely, do they understand when they walk down the streets of Burlington or someplace? I know Burlington is probably within 100 miles of the border, but when you walk down the streets of Burlington, are they aware of this kind of distinction in how you deal with the citizenry?
Even if they were aware of it, I don't think that the arrest quota and the supervision makes it something that they do well in practice. I doubt that they're aware of it. I haven't interrogated an ICE officer. But I will say, philosophically and physically, these federal enforcement actions happen at the border of the state, right? They are supposed to be the means by which the state, has its sovereignty and its sanctity in order to safely afford the citizens within the state the constitutional protections that they deserve and that are accorded to them. So I'm broadly sympathetic to the idea that when you're operating at the philosophical and physical border of the state, you have powers under the law that allow you to do the things that you would not normally do to a citizen. But we've seen that, like you said, is that's been upended, right? And we are exercising those powers like on everyday citizens. In what amounts to, I was thinking about it in the park before, is it's basically like the worst instance of the New York City stop and frisk regime, applied not to like carrying guns, but applied to citizenship, right? Where you're stopping droves and droves of people based on stereotypes and hunches and the slimmest pretext of justification in order to find the few of them that are not citizens or not here lawfully and then take them out.
So let me turn this now to the law side, and then we'll come back to some of the practicalities. So we have gone back and forth on, we want to cover state and federal responses to this, both litigation and administrative. We've gone back and forth on who should go next. We left it at Barry, but Vanita, you look like you were about to jump out of your seat, so do you want to go first?
I always look that way, I guess. I'll just quickly add a thing to respond to your question, which is that it isn't clear to any of us that when the CBP agents, right, so it isn't just ICE agents that are being deployed right now for interior enforcement, it's also CBP agents and agents from other components.
Give the acronym.
Sorry, the Customs and Border Patrol. And Customs and Border Patrol were definitely not trained to do interior enforcement. And so there's a real question about just the kind of whether CBP agents and some of the agents that have been deployed in our cities have received any type of additional training to be able to do interior enforcement, which, as you said, has a very different set of laws and protections than what people get at the border. And, one thing that there was a whistleblower who testified in Congress a few weeks ago. He left DHS from the general counsel's office and said the training went from 72 days to 42 days. It was supposed to be 582 hours, was set at 240 hours. Key parts of constitutional training was cut out. And I think that was an important reservoir of information about how the Department of Homeland Security was achieving its effort to have a surge of 10,000 agents hired into the agency very quickly to meet the quota that you've been talking about. And so, and the kind of relaxing, so to speak, of using administrative warrants rather than judicial warrants, the masking of these agents. There's been like layer on layer of what has changed around the way, of course, the federal government has always carried out immigration.
The imagery of tactical gear in the cities and all.
The imagery, I think, is one that I have heard from many chiefs, and I know Brandon agrees, but who from local and state law enforcement say that it is bringing them backwards. It's like it's pushing the entire kind of industry of law enforcement, and state and locals have kind of discarded those types of approaches to state and local law enforcement in most agencies. A lot of people in the public may not differentiate between what law enforcement agency is in their cities approaching, in their communities. These ICE agents and DHS agents don't live in their communities. They don't have the same connections that state and local law enforcement do. And a lot of chiefs are working day in and day out to kind of build trust in their communities where they live, and to have ICE agents kind of surge in as an occupying force, not knowing the community, in masks, using these tactics that are quite horrifying to the American public, I think is something that I've heard from chiefs, and Brandon should speak to this, that has been really kind of a setback for law enforcement writ large. So I just wanted to speak to that before we get into kind of heavier law issues,
and
so to
hopefully
speak.
we won't. Barry, so you've looked at this from the policing project side and from what's the response to this? Is there a state and local response? What do local police have in, what role do local police have in this?
So, I've been watching all of this happen, and even before Alex Preddy was killed and Renee Good was killed, I was just watching the ICE agents smashing in car windows and tackling people on the streets and thinking, this is just completely out of control. And so, of course, it's going to be out of control unless there's some way to get accountability, unless there's a way to get deterrence by imposing either civil sanctions or criminal sanctions. And Sam, I did this just for you because I know you love a 2x2.
Oh, yeah,
chart.
that's
And so
great.
Here you go. If everybody in their head will think on one of your axes that there's either a state or a federal kind of remedy, and then on the other it's civil or criminal. So we can cross off our list right away the federal criminal because this administration has no inclination whatsoever to bring criminal charges against any of its own officers. And we can pretty much cross off our list any sort of federal civil remedy. Many of you probably know about 1983 actions, but those actions for money damages or injunctions run against state officials, and not federal officials. There's something called a Bivens action, which is a way to sue federal officials for money damages for violating people's constitutional rights. And I'm happy to go back to that. It's tough to do, though I actually think it maybe could be done here. There's also a state civil action, an action for money damages against these officers in some states that have adopted what Akhil Amar calls a reverse or converse 1983 action. So let's use a remedy against federal officials for violating rights. But what's most interesting to me of all of this, and what I've been thinking from the very beginning watching it, is where are the state and local prosecutors? Why aren't they prosecuting federal officials? Now, you bring that up, and folks like J.D. Vance say, well, that's crazy. It can't possibly be true that state and local prosecutors can sue federal officials. And you do want to be careful here in case you're thinking, yeah, like, let's go do that now. I just want to point out that that some folks thought that during the civil rights movement when federal officials were in the South actually trying to protect the rights of protesters and could have had exactly the same problems with state and local prosecutors. And so there are a set of rules that govern when this can happen, but J.D. Vance could not have been more wrong. And in fact, if you just think back to like the first 100 years of the country, and you wanted to sue a state or federal official for violating constitutional rights, you didn't do it because there was something like, 1983 to bring a cause of action. You brought an ordinary tort suit, or you brought an ordinary criminal lawsuit under state law. And then the defense to that suit was, hey, I'm a federal official. You can't prosecute me. I'm doing my job. And then there was a way to take away that defense was, yeah, but you're violating federal law or you're violating constitutional rights. And so keep in your head, just real quickly, this sort of sue under state law, defend under federal law, take away the defense under the federal constitution, and that's the right way to do it. Now, let me just tell you two more things, which Vanita could have done this far better than I, though I'm going to pose a problem for Vanita in her experience. But one is, if a state prosecutor or a local prosecutor brings charges against ICE officials or Customs and Border Patrol officials, as I hope happens in some jurisdictions, the first thing that happens is they move the case to federal court, out of state court and into federal court. And that's how we know, actually, that state and local officials can sue these federal officials, is because there's long been a federal statute that says if that happens, it can be moved to federal court. And then the federal court has to answer two questions at the front end to figure out whether the prosecution can move forward. One is, was the official acting with the scope of their federal activities? So if yes, it belongs in federal court, we've got to get to the next step. If no, and there's a case about a postal worker driving a postal truck down the sidewalk and injuring somebody, and the court says that's obviously not part of your federal responsibilities, then the prosecution just goes forward in state court. If it is within the scope of their federal authority, then there's a next question that gets asked, which is what the officers did necessary to their job and proper within their area of responsibilities? And that's the question on which a lot of these lawsuits will ultimately end up in trouble, because it's hard to argue that what's happened wasn't necessary and proper to their federal enforcement authority. But a lot of what I've watched on television, I don't think plausibly was within that necessary and proper authority, in which case I think and have thought that the state and local prosecution should go forward. Now there's a glitch, and this is where I'm going to stop because it's not at all my area of expertise, which is, you still have to pry the evidence out of federal hands sometimes. And that's been a real obstacle in some of these cases because the federal government has had no willingness to comply or help. But I think we have expertise at the table here, including Vanita, on that question, though I don't know if that's where you're going next, Sam.
Well, just on this point, you use the term prosecute, and that's a complicated term because you could refer to civil or criminal. The normal way in which I think this should unfold is when you're not seeking injunctive relief, but when you're seeking damages for misbehavior by an ICE official, let's say, you sue in tort. Just ordinary tort. You beat me, you assaulted me, there was a battery, whatever, you sue in tort. And then federal law allows the federal government three things. One is removal. One is it will give that officer, depending upon the determination by federal officials, immunity in the sense of indemnification. And so, and if you get that immunity, you also have to sue under the Federal Tort Claims Act, which has a great number of restrictions because now you're suing into the public fisc because of the indemnification. You put all that together and everything turns on the scope of duty. And it strikes me that there is real legal vulnerability for ICE officials because they are pushing the margins of their training, they're pushing the margins of their expertise. And I think that that I've talked to quite a number of lawyers who called me about this in recent period, and there is a reluctance among the kind of ACLU type lawyers to think away from federal law. They all think, there's 1983, oh no, they're federal officials. There's Bivens. There's no Bivens anymore, come on. But anyway, we'll leave that to the side. And what's left, federal law is primarily a source of immunities, not liabilities. And so what's left is the common law. So I know that you're from the federal side, but I think these people should be held accountable on normal conditions of tort and the various common law claims. That's how we got the political question doctrine originally. It arose out of a contest over who was the rightful governor of Rhode Island. And the governor entered the home with troops of the opposition leader, and he sued in tort. He sued in trespass. And at that point, federal law has to kick in. So.
Yeah, it's so let me take a step back because I do think we jumped right into civil remedies and we're skipping some important steps of what would have typically happened in a typical Justice Department process under prior Republican and Democratic administrations, just to talk about kind of how this would have gone on the criminal side, because I think the tort stuff, the tort actions are important, but I want to talk about why they're also limited. And you hinted a little bit about some of the procedural constraints on tort actions. So in this process, putting aside the fact that it is hard to imagine this type of ICE and DHS enforcement in other administrations, let's take that accept that for what it is. In a typical type of process where a person was killed by a federal agent, what would have typically happened was that the Civil Rights Division prosecutors would have flown out to, and I'm going to just use Alex Preddy as an example to make this very concrete, would have flown out to the scene and met with members of the Minneapolis U.S. Attorney's Office and FBI agents, the local agents. They live there, breathe their work in Minneapolis day in and day out, and would have put together an investigation protocol and started immediately investigating on the scene, at the crime scene, and also would have done so with state investigators present, meaning that the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, as it's called, it would have been on the scene working hand in hand with the FBI and the local prosecutors and the Civil Rights Division prosecutors to investigate whether a federal crime had been committed. Now, the crime, there's one statute that gives the Justice Department the authority to prosecute federal agents for violating a person's constitutional rights and civil rights, and that's 18 U.S.C. 242. It has the highest bar for criminal intent. It requires the ability of prosecutors to prove that the agent specifically had the specific intent to violate a person's constitutional and civil rights, meaning that they set out to violate their rights and their rights were violated. And that is a very, very high bar for a prosecutor, federal prosecutor, to establish. It does happen. The Civil Rights Division, so as Associate Attorney General, I oversaw the Civil Rights Division, which prosecutes or can prosecute federal agents. I also oversaw the Civil Division, which defends federal agents or can defend federal agents when they are being prosecuted, for instance, by states. So this would have been an effort that would have been carried out. And remember, so this doesn't happen that often where federal agents, the federal agents kill far fewer people than state and local. They don't do patrol policing typically. This is not what federal agents do. This is patrol policing, street policing is really the purview of state and local police. And so, there's a kind of body of case law that is developed, but these prosecutions definitely take place. And they are pursuant to a set of the federal use of force standard, which was actually updated in 2022 to specifically bar shooting at moving vehicles except in the most exigent of circumstances, because shooting at moving vehicles is a deeply reckless thing to do. Bystanders can get killed. It's very out of practice, already been for years, state and local law enforcement had adopted policy to ban that type of practice for that reason. It was adopted and incorporated in 2022. There's also de-escalation, the duty to render medical aid, all of these things that frankly have been very much put into question about whether the federal agents on the scene that killed Alex Preddy and Renee Good actually complied with. So that would have been the kind of the way that this would have happened, and the state would have been side by side evaluating whether they wanted to separately prosecute under state law the actions of the federal agent. These are very hard cases to obtain convictions. It's much easier to charge than it is to obtain a conviction. It will be very hard even if the state or county chooses to prosecute. They may charge. It's going to be a hard set of cases to obtain a conviction, to obtain convictions on, but I think there are more than enough facts for the local and state prosecutors to evaluate to potentially charge. But to your point, so that's the criminal prosecution, right? Like that's the thing that we think about first and foremost. You're absolutely right. I don't think there's much left of Bivens either. So if you look at the federal torts claim, there are already actually a lot of tort actions getting filed right now, and people are filing them right now because they know, the lawyers who do this work know how long and laborious these cases are. You have to exhaust administrative remedies. There's all kinds of ways in which the federal government, there's a lot of defenses that are...
But that's if you're suing the federal government.
That's if you're suing the federal government.
Federal government.
Right.
Not if you're suing an individual in tort.
Totally. And so I expect there will be a lot of FTCA cases against agents for all kinds of actions. But it is procedurally, it takes a long, long time. And so, but what my question is what degree do kind of tort actions help change policy? Because this may be a new environment that we're in where the level of tort actions it will in some way compensate victims, but will it effectuate a change of policy? I think that remains to be seen, but I think it's important that we are also not in a world where the federal government is acting like a typical actor, as Barry said. And so looking at the avenues for relief and for compensation to the victims and to the communities that have been harmed by that, I think is an important question that people are really trying to understand right now. And there's a lot of also local law reform happening to try to bolster up local infrastructure and give local and state officials more levers to address accountability.
I
So,
wanted to
Brendan, yeah, there's
interject
about
very.
a dozen questions for you in there, but go ahead.
Yeah, no, I wanted to interject quickly because I know the folks on the dais probably know this, but maybe not the general audience. In the New York City Police Department, except for very stringent circumstances, which were definitely not met in Minneapolis, you've been prohibited from shooting at cars since the mid-1970s, right? For the last 50 years. When the NYPD instituted that policy, their officer-involved shootings went down about, don't quote me, but about 40% in 1 year. And there hasn't been an instance where a New York City police officer complying with that procedure has suffered serious injury. So it's not as if we're puzzling through how we should act around people trying to get away from the police in cars. Like the largest municipal agency in the Western world has known what to do for 50 years. And ICE has been completely ignorant of that. As we've seen in Minneapolis. And it just occurred to me when we're talking about remedies, if they were a municipal agency, in my opinion, having been on a consent decree monitoring team, the pattern and practice we've seen in ICE, if it were another type of agency, would merit a consent decree.
It certainly would have merited an investigation, but I won't
I'm
speak
skipping
to
ahead
the
too,
finding
yeah.
of the facts, but that is, I don't
The
think.
lawyer, the cop, but you get the point
But
here.
Brendan, on this point of how effective are any of these at actually altering behavior on the ground, and are there mechanisms of self-help available to state and local enforcement authorities faced with this kind of changed environment that we're in right now?
I think, first of all, there are a few ways to alter behavior at the individual level. And one, like my own career, but also the research we've done into altering officer behavior shows they strive to meet the behavioral expectations of their immediate supervisors. That comes up again and again in why officers do or don't engage in harm reduction, why they do or don't use force, why they do or don't make arrests. It's not their mom, their partner, or their chief. It's literally their immediate supervisor that holds the most behavioral control. There's no indication that ICE has any coherent way of firmly supervising these poorly trained officers, as I said before, to get behavioral change. And the second thing is like routine accountability in a way that could derail your career, right? But when you say instead, don't wear a mask, don't give anyone your name, and we're not going to care much if you use a body camera or not, and we don't have a formal way of adjudicating complaints that could have a meaningful penalty, that's also lack of there's no behavioral change mechanism in there. For example, one of the standards in the Newark consent decree, when I went blind looking at body camera footage, is in an interaction, does an officer either A, preemptively identify themselves, or are they in full uniform in daylight in a way where they can easily be identified, right? So you have this standard, and that's a widely held standard in municipal policing. If you are in plain clothes, not wearing a nameplate and a shield with a shield number, the standard is before you engage, unless there's an emergency, I am Agent Del Pozo, and I'm from ICE, and this is what I'm doing, right? There's none of that happening as a standard in these encounters.
Another point that Vanita raised, on the use of deadly force, we've heard that there's a difference between standard policing operations on shooting at moving vehicles. Is there any other difference in the use of deadly force?
I should just say, I don't believe with the current federal use of force standard memorializes best practices from state and locals, including not shooting at moving vehicles.
So that's already
In there,
That's
yeah.
all. That's
So
already in there.
The work to be done is not on reviewing the federal use of force. It's on the training and accountability on the back end, because the use of force standards, actually, the revision was driven by a lot of the work that state and local policing associations had already done, and so this is not a standards problem. It's a kind of use and training and implementation.
Barry, that's something you've been in charge of.
Yeah, well, it's something I focused on, but I want to just push back on sort of the gestalt at the table before I move in that direction, which is, you listen to this conversation and you might think, it's really impossible to do anything about this. But I have been watching it unfold on television, and I guess I think we need to push boundaries because what I'm watching happen on television isn't acceptable. And I want to draw a distinction that I think is important. The federal government is engaging in aggressive immigration enforcement. You may agree with it, you may disagree with it, but it is within the ambit of federal law for them to do that. And so any impeding or interfering with that process is not going to go well for anybody, be they citizens or be they law enforcement officials from state, local law enforcement, though that's not been their inclination. But what I've seen is a lot of uses of force and property destruction and entering people's homes and hauling people off in ways that look pretty, and I haven't done an investigation, like I don't know, but that's the point of investigations, but things that I am watching that look to me to be wildly unconstitutional. And so if what you're watching is widespread, arguably unconstitutional activity, the question is, what can you do about it? And I guess my reaction to watching it all, again, was where are the state and local prosecutors? Because, you know, Brandon was talking about incentives for people who want to have these long careers and their supervisors, but I don't think that's the world we're in. We're in the world in which they hired thousands of people to earn their $50,000 bonus and do whatever they're going to do, and I don't know that that's their career in any way whatsoever. But I'll tell you this. They've all been told that they are immune from any kind of reaction by state and local officials, and that just it isn't true, and it shouldn't be true. And my guess is, but again, you probably know far better than I, that if any number of ICE agents or CPB agents were charged with criminal offenses, and I'm not just talking about deadly force, I'm talking about destruction of property in violation of the Fourth Amendment, I'm talking about uses of force on the street in violation of the Fourth Amendment. I guess if I was one of those folks, I'd think, whoa, wait a minute. I mean, it's just not that much fun being a criminal defendant. It isn't. And you don't know what's going to happen at the end of the road. And I think if there was some of that, I mean, and everybody here should just jump all over me, and I'm probably wrong, but I think there'd be a deterrent effect to some of those charges.
So,
being brought.
Brandon, what do you think of a new Shays Rebellion, which I think is what Barry is advocating
I think,
here?
you know, there's not a lot in criminological theory that you can hang your hat on, but one of the things that does come up again and again over the decades when it comes to punishment is it's not the severity of the punishment that modifies behavior, but the certainty and the swiftness. And I think that's kind of what you're saying. That it doesn't have to be a murder case every time, but if there was some swiftly administered criminal sanctions for property destruction, for all the things you described, and they were publicized, I think that would, I mean, you hear a lot of police unions going, oh, they arrested this cop in this city for doing his job, and our cops are afraid to do anything. Like, that's a subtle way of saying, hey, like, it actually works to modify behavior. The other thing that I think comes to mind when we're talking about use of force standards is there's a big difference in modern municipal policing between what is lawfully permitted and what is a matter of training and policy given the desire to sanctify human life. So one of the things that American policing was endeavoring to do in many quarters was to say we know what the floor is, but we're aiming for the ceiling. We will train to a higher standard than the law requires in order to police justly and to sanctify human life. And if you're interested in seeing it, like the Police Executive Research Forum came out, I guess around 2017, with like guiding principles for the use of force. And the first guiding principle is sanctifying human life, being parsimonious about the amount of force you use. And they say up front, this is not what the legal standard is. This is what we owe citizens as human beings. And then what follows from that is guidance about de-escalation, is guidance about shooting at vehicles, is guidance about accountability, and what the ICE agents have been told is like none of that matters. Just meet the floor, do what is basically legal, and don't worry about what those crazy folks are telling you about the sanctity of human life.
Yeah, I don't even think that it's the floor. They're below the floor.
Right.
Because they're applying a set of constitutional principles which would not apply to American citizens or to people living in the rest of the country, away from the border. So I think that it's not just, we're hearing that different legal standards, a lack of training, a lack of discipline, a lack of internal coherence. Go ahead.
I think it's also, it's worse than that when you have the Vice President of the United States, a trained lawyer, say that agents have absolute immunity, and this is in the middle of what is happening in Minneapolis, which is patently false, and we just explained why, given that federal agents can be prosecuted. So I want to go back to this, what Barry thought was a provocation, which I don't actually think any of us here would disagree with, which is there has to be accountability for what has been happening. And there's just an article yesterday, and everyone's been anticipating. Mayors have been preparing, governors are preparing, for this potential that Minneapolis would come to their district. I think that there's a lot of different kind of places where people are pushing for stopping the current abuses and addressing them. And I think Barry and a few of us have been talking about state prosecutions as one of them. I do think state criminal prosecutions would have a deterrent effect. I worry, though, that if there are prosecutions that result in acquittals, what message is that sending? But, you've got to have accountability from somewhere. So so putting aside the state prosecutions, Sam, you mentioned FTCA cases. Those are going to take too long. They don't get at the swiftness, but they're a civil lever for accountability. There are, right now, I know we've all forgotten, but the government is allegedly shut down, or at least DHS isn't getting any money. So there's an effort by Democrats in Congress right now to withhold the budget for the Department of Homeland Security based on the way DHS has been manifesting itself in cities across the country. And they have pushed for certain basic things. Some of them are things that are very pie in the sky, but I think make a point around ending racial profiling, because another thing DHS is doing here is racially profiling black and brown people in these cities in order to meet their quota. But also about removal of masks, the requirement to show ID. They're pushing for stopping the use of administrative warrants to enter people's homes and require judicial warrants. There are a number of kind of provisions that they are saying that the agency needs to meet and abide by in order for DHS to continue to be funded. So that is another area that that's part of the budget negotiation. We don't know where it's going to go. There's some other requirements in there around the requirement to use body cams, et cetera, that are part of this negotiation on the federal side. Separately, there are bills that we're not holding our breath here, but I want to mention them, bills on reverse 1983, on trying to make Bivens have any life again and kind of correct what the courts have done to Bivens to make it almost impossible to get accountability. And then there's state legislation, as I mentioned. There are states that have been doing all kinds of things, state AGs that have put up citizen portals to get residents to upload video of potential ICE abuse so that they can investigate it and they can document it and they can track it to figure out are there cases to be brought. There are states that are seeking to pass laws around being able to co-access crime scenes so that they can't get boxed out the way that they have been in the Pretty and Good investigations. And so I won't rattle through others, but there are all these efforts right now, I think really because Minneapolis kind of woke up the country around how badly this could go and how harmful this is, to figuring out all of the different levers to contain a federal government that otherwise seems to want to try to convince the American people that these federal agents have absolute immunity when they absolutely do not and should be held accountable for violations of the Constitution.
So Brandon, let me, we're getting a little too close to consensus here, so let me disrupt a little bit. Had we held this program 6-7 years ago, and we talked about the abuses by law enforcement and the abusive use of force and things of that sort, the program would have been directed at local police authorities as the culprits, and the heroes would have been the feds. So it is possible, if we think that is being inverted, that the feds have fallen very far. It's possible that our expectations have been lowered. It's also possible that the state and local folks have risen up and cleaned up their act. What if somebody were more skeptical and just thought, there's just too much open fire on American citizens by law enforcement, period. And the fact that the feds are doing it somewhat wantonly now is just an illustration of what's wrong with all use of force by law enforcement here. So,
You want to say something about this too?
I-
No, I'm happy to talk about it. I'm conscious of dividing our time equally.
you're doing great. So
Yeah, right. I mean, the number of people shot and killed by police has been remarkably stubborn despite any type of political movement or reform. If you account for the growth in the U.S. population and the increase in guns among the U.S. population, it is a fairly, controlling for those two things, a remarkably constant number. There's a tremendous amount to unpack. My colleagues just had a study that shows, it's out open access in a preprint server, that the more police that show up, the more shots get fired, and the more shots get fired, the more likely someone is to die in a very marginal and predictive way. And police haven't unpacked really fully how to kill fewer people in mental health crises, fewer people with armed with knives. Rather, I am broadly sympathetic to police who defend themselves and others when someone else has an actual gun or is indistinguishable from a gun. And I think it'll be very hard to reduce the number past that. I think the margin, approximately, don't quote me, like we could meaningfully reduce about 25% of those killings till we start getting to cases where I think there was a true necessity. But all of that said, I think what we're seeing is there's 18,000 police agencies in the United States. There are still plenty of like alarmingly mediocre or bad ones out there. There are definitely police agencies out there where the consensus is like, man, those ICE guys are doing cool stuff and I really wish I was them. There are people who are leaving police agencies to join ICE to behave this way. But what we have been seeing are there are agencies out there that have put in the last decade a lot of work into improving their practices, especially the leadership acknowledging the need for that improvement and putting their voice behind it with policy and with practice. I was at the Police Executive Research Forum's annual meeting in Nashville last May, and they brought up immigration enforcement. And what it is a convening of like all the cool men and women in American policing, plus random former police professors, like in a room, just going over the topics of the day. The leaders of every major department, like the chiefs, the commissioners. And when they brought up ICE, there was a visceral disgust in the room at the idea of men and women wearing masks and doing law enforcement. It wasn't like, oh, but, they might get doxxed, or oh, but, there's a good, it was visceral disgust. And I found very, very heartening. Also, chiefs complaining. I have immigrants who are afraid to call me for help because they're afraid of getting entangled in law enforcement. So I have to stress, like there's not, number one, it's not like Stockholm Syndrome. Oh, ICE is so bad that we should be thankful we just have regular mediocre policing, right? It's also not all American policing is better than the feds, because there are plenty of agencies out there that are still fairly backward. But there is like a group of core American police leaders that have done the work, and they happen to be in like a lot of big cities that are watching it get undone or reversed before their eyes because of ICE, or that are reacting with visceral disgust, especially when they're in a room where they're amongst themselves.
So Barry, we've talked about this over the years. I first came at this from the military standpoint, and when a soldier's been shot and is an enemy soldier and is down, to shoot him again is a war crime. Whereas our policing seems to be heavily geared to the right to open fire, whether or not that's met, but then very little control on the number of bullets that ensue in ways that would be a war crime if committed by a soldier. So why is it that what Brandon said is so? Is it the culture? Is it the law? Is it the training that there is such a stubbornness to police killings?
So, I just want to reiterate something I said earlier in this different context, which is we tend to focus on shootings and killings, and I understand that, but You really, to understand what's happening over time, you need to look at the entire range of the use
Right,
of
but
force.
if you look at the response to ICE, it was shooting a couple of people to death in the streets. So that there's something, it's not just visceral, there's something at the point, look, I'm originally from Argentina, at the point when they start shooting you on the street, that's when things are really going bad.
Don't get me wrong, I couldn't agree with you more. I'm just saying that if you're evaluating American policing, as Brandon just was, you need to look beyond the shootings. And, Vanita has been a leader in all of this and done incredible work within the federal government to really try to bring the resources of the federal government to bear. Brandon put his finger on a lot of the problems. We actually don't know how many. Tracy Mears, who's a professor at Yale, one of her stock lines is, I can tell you exactly how many schools there are in the United States, but I can't tell you how many policing agencies there are. So we say 18,000, we don't really know. But think about the command and control for 18,000 agencies. You're going to get an incredible variance in the quality and in the training and whatnot. And so you're going to get some really terrible stuff. But I think overall, and certainly in the major cities in the United States, and certainly working with folks like Vanita in the federal government, there has been a movement toward trying to build greater community trust, to trying to reduce use of force, to trying to do things like stopping stupid police pursuits or shooting at cars. And I think that's just what's underscored how crazy what we've all been watching is, which is that, and again, I'm not, if you've known me long, I'm a critic of a lot in American policing, but it's been on an upward arc in many ways. And so for these police chiefs to watch what's happening and everything that they've tried to promote over the last 10 or 15 years has, I think, really been appalling.
So Vanita, you were running these efforts from the federal government side. What's your thoughts? And then we'll take questions
Yeah,
from
it'd be great
students
to have
right
questions.
afterwards. So,
No, I think that all of that is right, and it is. I think it kind of goes back to what I was saying, and it's what Brandon was saying, which is that for a lot of police chiefs that have been working, especially since the events in Ferguson in 2014 and 2015, that was kind of a wake-up call around use of force. And sparked a national conversation around de-escalation, trying to engage differently with people in mental health crises, et cetera, that what ICE is doing is a complete setback and is undermining all of law enforcement's efforts to engage in best practices, to reform, and to have the trust of their communities. And so this is a inflection point, I think, for our country. I also think, quite honestly, that the fact that ICE and CBP killed white U.S. citizens was a significant wake-up call for people watching those videos, the video in their homes, and really understanding the degree to which everyone is at risk with this type of behavior. It brought it home in a way that for better or for worse, people may not have felt when they were seeing kids snatched from schools or hospitals and then, put into deportation proceedings. Having 2 white U.S. citizens kill this way, I think, was, a kind of an inflection point on this conversation around what type of immigration enforcement are we going to allow, and more fundamentally, what kind of country are we going to be? So I think this is an important moment. I don't have faith that the federal government is going to. I don't think we're going to see Minneapolis type enforcement now. I think the public outrage was really important. Now, I am very worried still about how immigration enforcement will be conducted across the country. But my hope is that state and local law enforcement will be able to lift their voices. I was really impressed by Brian O'Hara, the Minneapolis police chief, who really took to the airways to talk very seriously about these dynamics in his city. And there's nobody with more credibility than the police chief himself to take to the airways to talk about the strain and stress this was creating for local law enforcement, for his agency, and just how abhorrent some of these practices are. So again, the federal government is not going to do what it has done in the past. We have gaps in federal accountability, and I think we've all talked about what that is and how those gaps need to be filled. But my hope is that Minneapolis was a wake-up call, at least to a certain degree, for how immigration enforcement will be conducted. But we're having a raging debate about immigration in this country as well. And, this is all of a piece. This is not just a law enforcement problem. This is also a problem around how we do this type of, how we enforce our immigration laws and what the answers are.
If there are questions, please raise your hand, come up. If not, I will continue. You raise immigration, but these federal forces are being used for all sorts of interests that have very little to do with immigration. If we're about to have elections and there's election disorder, one can imagine that these are not, I don't want to say the shock troops, but these are the advanced guard of the federal. So we're seeing them penetrate a whole range of things. Was there a question? Please.
Yes, thank you all for taking the time to speak with us. On the understanding that national level opportunities for legislation tend to be pretty limited these days, if a reform-minded administration and Congress are elected at some point, I'm curious to hear what your number one priority would be for a policy to enact that will durably ameliorate some of these. And it can be either within the immigration space or within the law enforcement space or some third area that might help with some of these problems.
Great question. Who wants to solve all of today's problems?
I'm actually going to start in a surprising place, which is that, one could talk about use of force and one could talk about remedies, but I actually think and I'm just going to put in a quick note here because I was sad that we had to cancel the forum a couple weeks ago during the blizzard. The federal government is literally out of control, collecting all of the personal data on everyone in this room and everyone else, and using that to identify people. I was just talking in London about how people are being labeled domestic terrorists, and I held up a picture of what the domestic terrorists look like, which probably look like a lot of your grandparents in Minneapolis. And I think it is terrifying. And if I always say this: if the framers of the Constitution or the people that lived in that generation had any notion about government collecting all of this personal information, they would have thought it was insane, and it is insane. And so that is where I would start.
Okay, Brandon, where were?
No, it's as far as federal regulation goes, I want to dodge that question, but I do want to say.
But wait, but before you dodge it, how about I think the implication? How about compelled coordination with local officials for domestic use of Border Patrol or ICE or something of that sort?
I was about to say that we have this vast array of thousands of police departments out doing their own thing, and then the feds interacting with them. And the moonshot that has been hard to pursue is standardizing some of these practices and standardizing coordination and standardizing accountability. And you get this wide variance in that in American policing that's been very, very unhelpful. And somehow if the feds could tie that to budgetary funding or tie that to other sources of municipal funding or do something to bring America's police in line among standards, I think that would help. And that would then present ICE as even more of an outcast and give them an even greater onus to say why they aren't meeting these widely held standards. Because in other nations, the police are nationalized and the standards are clear, and the aberration from those standards is not just, they do it differently in Alabama. It's no, we do it the same way. We're all skiing in the same direction in Norway, and this one dude is skiing the other way. That's obvious.
It's interesting because one could also make the argument that the recent events in Minneapolis show why you don't want a single national force in this country. A lot of things are being turned on their head right now in terms of federal-state dynamics. But I agree. I mean, the federal government, though, it has limited levers. And I say this as a former federal government official. I mean, policing is fundamentally a local thing. And so, and there are maybe good reasons for that because it brings the leadership and the force closer to their community, et cetera. But to answer your question, Jeremy, I know it's Jeremy because he's been in he was my research assistant. There is no silver bullet, but I will say, after George Floyd was murdered in Minneapolis, there was the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act that was proposed in Congress that had about 100 provisions that were really important at tackling any number of issues related to law enforcement. And it was an effort to create national standards for local and state policing. Congress didn't pass it, and so we in the Justice Department and in the White House spent over a year basically negotiating and working with state and local law enforcement and our federal agencies on the executive order on policing that President Biden signed in May of 2022. And it had 92 provisions just for the Justice Department alone. That was part of the impetus for updating the federal use of force standards across the federal government, but had a number of really important reforms, including a national database of accountability for being able to track agents or officers who had long disciplinary records, so hiring agents wouldn't bring them back onto the force, et cetera. That was erased on day one of the Trump administration, and I think there's still a lot of value to consider legislating that. There's also legislation around fixing the Bivens Act, as I said, reverse 1983 cases to say there's going to be accountability when federal agents violate the law. So I don't think we have to start from scratch here. There's actually a huge framework to work from. The question is always political will and whether Congress will, whether in these very polarized times people will come together on these solutions. But until then, we are relying on police chiefs and leaders and kind of the accountability measures that we've talked about on this panel to kind of hold this together to protect people in our cities and in our towns in this country.
And I do want to push back for 1 second about the heterogeneity of policing, because there is a difference in the cultural dynamics of policing Menlo Park versus like Chicago, right? You do want to have tailored solutions that meet those needs, but like cars aren't made or driven differently in those places, and body cameras. I'm not saying I think that there's the people who resist reform make the heterogeneity argument. But it is correct at this important cultural level. It is not correct at like this basic best practices level.
And it's why the Justice Department's consent decrees provided kind of a basic, other police chiefs around the country would look at, there were very few Justice Department consent decrees, but there was a reason why they were used for training across the country, because they did provide this kind of basic constitutional standards for policing, regardless of what community they were in. There are basic fundamentals that we as Americans should expect from our law enforcement.
Go ahead.
You guys, is this on? Okay, cool. So we were speaking, or you guys touched on like the floor that the federal government has kind of like originally or prior to the Trump administration has kind of reached like a certain standard, like above what was constitutionally mandated, and it seems like they've now like fallen even like below that floor. And there's like state, whether it be like governors or AGs or just like even state propositions that are geared to try and raise that floor. Maybe like for example, like I'm a California native. There was some legislation trying to enforce like state officers from not, or any officer exercising their powers therein in the state of California to not have like masks. I was wondering, like, if you think that like how that would comport with like federal law, or if they're like, maybe to analogize it, like if that would be an issue where like if every different state and every different jurisdiction had different practices for federal officers, it would come into like this thing kind of like akin to like the Dormant Commerce Clause, where like there's different mud flaps.
There's a supremacy clause issue there, but Barry, what's the boundaries that the states can actually police here?
Yeah, I've always been fascinated by this question. There's this case in which the police engaged in a trash drop. They collected somebody's trash to figure out whether they were dealing drugs. And the question was whether it violated the Fourth Amendment. It came from California, and California had prohibited police under their state constitution from using trash drops. And so the question is, what's the rule? And the Supreme Court says, well, but states can't determine the scope of the Fourth Amendment. And that's like not even just for federal officials, but for their own officials. And I think that's nuts. I think it's a really interesting question whether states could impose rules on federal officers. In other areas of the law, the general rule is that states can have laws that bind the federal government so long as they don't discriminate against the federal government. So long as, for example, if you think of property law that is applying to federal property and state property, so long as it's even across the boards, there have been places where Congress has said, that's fine, you can do this. I can see how it would be untenable in some ways to do that with law enforcement officials, but I've never been entirely persuaded that for certain things, I mean, the Fourth Amendment, just to take an example, talks about or the Supreme Court has cashed it out to talk about reasonable expectations of privacy. But where would your expectations of privacy come from more than within state law itself? So it sounds crazy to people, and I get why it sounds crazy, but I think it's an interesting way to
What
put that.
sounds crazy to me from matters that I teach, California Constitution addresses trash dumps. I'm just trying to get my head around what perversion of the political process has taken us to that point. But yes, you had a question? No, we have time for one more, right? Yes, please.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. Okay, I apologize if some of what I'm about to ask is like normal American knowledge. I'm an LLM who's lived elsewhere. I know from 2 weeks ago there were allegations that NYPD was supporting ICE and apprehending someone in kind of a street raid. And I'm just curious what you feel the role right now. What is the legal line of what state police or local police can and cannot do in terms of working with or fighting against ICE in their neighborhoods?
So Brandon, what's the word on the street?
I mean, they certainly
what
can't.
you can do and not do.
You can't interfere with the federal operations, but we in Burlington and in New York had a basic policy of non-cooperation, but there is this strain. Like if we heard, and this has happened many times in my police career, that like a federal agent is in danger, needs help, has been shot, is chasing someone, you always go to help them, right? It's police protecting police, not in some thin blue line way. It's just like, it's a basic professional standard to help that officer and safeguard their life and their safety. But now when the officers respond, they're like, what am I getting myself into and what the hell is happening here? And a lot of times we've seen ICE have to use these terrible crowd control measures to disperse crowds, ways that like the NYPD would never need to use tear gas and pepper balls, because no one is, in Chicago and in Minneapolis, no one is coming to help ICE do that because the local police don't want to get involved in this crap, right? I'm not sure exactly where Commissioner Tisch's head is on this as a matter of policy, but the basic standard was non-cooperation with like ICE enforcement efforts. I don't know how that's changing or shifting, and I know the government will tie funding to municipalities for things like that.
And there have been around the country governors recently like getting legislatures to pass laws on non-cooperation, and some are doing it locally at the local ordinance level. But what they're risking there is an administration that will then act with retribution and pull a whole bunch of funds on infrastructure and other things that we've seen take place. But regardless of that, we have seen states, I think, like Maryland and Illinois and a few others that have basically said, our local law enforcement won't cooperate with these types of federal raids, and then the states will deal with the consequences of that if the administration decides to pull federal funding for things like infrastructure and other such things. That's been happening too.
I have a
I'll just
colleague at the
say is
University of Virginia who was about to submit a grant to the Bureau of Justice Assistance, and it was due at midnight. And one of the conditions of submitting the grant is the institution pledging like an allegiance to ICE policy. I'm giving you the non-lawyerly phrasing. And the university, UVA, said, we can't sign this, so you can't submit this grant. And the grant just died.
So as the oldest person on this panel, I can still remember when, the local officials have pledged not to cooperate with the federal officials because of deeper state policies. That
Yeah, it's
doesn't
usually-
necessarily
right,
have a
it's usually
positive
reversed.
spin in my mind. But we are out of time, and so please thank our panel for